Welcome to Cleantech Forward, a Foresight podcast where we explore clean tech customers, capital, and Canada's path to net zero. Tune in to learn more about Canada's most exciting clean tech startups, industry success stories, investor insights, and academic initiatives as we accelerate the growth and impact of clean tech together.
This Cleantech Forward podcast is supported by Gowling WLG. A global leader in intellectual property law, Gowling WLG works alongside Canadian cleantech companies to develop IP strategies that maximize business opportunities and increase market share while protecting valuable innovation. From idea to investment to international expansion, Gowling WLG understands the potential of your intellectual property at every stage of growth. Visit gowlingwlg.com/cleantech to learn how they can support your business today. Welcome to Cleantech Forward. I'm Jeanette Jackson, CEO of Foresight Canada. Today, we're doing something a little different. It's Plastic-Free July, and the prospect of a plastic-free world is something to celebrate. Plastics have become an enormous problem. This waste is everywhere, accumulating in alarming quantities in our landfills, our oceans, and even our bodies. Microplastics have become ubiquitous in our environment and are affecting human health in a number of ways that aren't fully understood, impacting our immune systems and causing reproductive and developmental issues. They've even been linked to increased risks of certain cancers by multiple studies. Plastic production is a major contributor to our global greenhouse gas emissions, and many plastic producing facilities and waste disposal sites are near low-income and vulnerable communities, forcing them to bear disproportionate environmental and health risks. According to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, over 400 million tons of plastic are produced, and at least 14 million tons of plastic end up in the ocean every year. Plastic makes up 80% of all marine debris found from surface waters to deep sea sediments. The Center for International Environmental Law predicts that there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish by weight by 2050 unless we change our habits now. The main problem is that this petroleum-based product is everywhere. It's used for packaging, building and construction, household and sports equipment, vehicles, electronics, and agriculture. And far, far too much of it is designed to be single-use. We desperately need to change this system and find our way to a plastic-free environment. As we transition away from fossil fuels toward renewable resources, getting plastic alternatives to scale is going to be a major challenge. But for the meantime, moving away from the use and discard model we currently have in place is absolutely critical. Which is why for this episode, we've reached out to Jason Hawkins, the CEO of reusables.com. Reusables is a container sharing platform that enables companies to reduce the amount of waste they create. They have developed a container tracking platform that helps businesses move away from single-use packages by replacing them with reusable containers that can be tracked and collected or returned. Here's more from Jason about how he got into the sustainability space, his concerns around single-use plastics, and how his technology and platform is helping us transition to a world with less plastic.
I think like many folks who find themselves in climate technology, clean technology, have some personal affiliation with protecting what we have. So, I like to spend time outside and would love to keep it that way for my kids and their kids. So figured, when I was a young age, this is kind of what I want to do, where I want to spend my career. I found myself focusing on food and local food systems early on. I started a farm to table marketplace in my second year of university, and then sold that to a grocery retailer. Went on to work for Spud and FoodX, and spent about 4 years there working with large grocery retailers, helping them to design online grocery fulfillment systems that were more circular, more sustainable, enabled local food producers to participate. And from there, kind of discovered and came across the adjacent problem of packaging and plastic within food service and grocery. So at that point, I met my co-founder Anastasia, who I was doing an internship at Spud, and we teamed up from there and have been working on reusables.com for about a couple of years since.
So reusables.com is a container sharing platform for zero waste takeout. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about how your solution works?
Where we started a couple of years ago was within food delivery and takeout. So we we said, okay, let's put out a pilot test in East Vancouver and see, it was during the pandemic, restaurants were closed down. They could only really deliver to people's homes. So packaging waste was kind of exploding with food delivery. And we wanted to see, was there really any interest in this from consumers, from restaurants? Was anybody willing to pay for this? So we put out a very basic pilot and made it a membership-based program for consumers. And we had really great uptake. We kind of doubled our goal in the first month of users and number of stores. So we decided this is kind of worth pursuing more. And since then, we've iterated through many different types of models. If you can think about how you can borrow and return packaging, there's many different ways to do it: deposit systems, fee-based systems, membership systems, restaurant pays, user pays, etc. And we've kind of tested out a variety of different business models and landed in one that we think optimizes for the environmental impact and for the user experience, both for the store and for the consumer. And that's what we like to call this tap to reuse or library-like system. So how it works for users, they don't actually pay anything more. They don't have to do anything differently at the restaurant if they're ordering on Uber Eats or if they're going in person. All they need to do is just tap their credit card. And if they don't return within a couple of weeks, then they would be charged a refundable amount for their container, and they can return it to any participating store at any time, even after that, and get a full refund on that. So it's effectively free for people as long as they play by the rules within 2 weeks. And now we have a network of about 100 stores in Vancouver, restaurants, cafes, grocery stores, where people can borrow and return their packaging.
So when you kicked off reusables, I myself, you might not know this, serial entrepreneur, I've had a few successes. I've had a few, what I like to call learning experiences. But I remember for every venture, I had this aha moment where I thought, you know what, this shit's going to work. It's going to work. What was your aha moment, or the moment that you realized that this was going to be a big opportunity, not only to have an impact on sustainability, but to make a good business out of it?
Practically speaking, what we did is we actually looked around the world and we said, okay, like, let's just kind of face the fact, like, reusing packaging is actually not new. We're talking like we've fallen into this sort of take, make, waste economy of consumerism and throwing things away in the last, call it, 100 years, right? So maybe not even that. And if you look before then, or if you look to sort of the global East, like look at India, and now even look at Europe, like with the way legislation's moving, there are examples of how reuse, like localized reuse and even at scale reuse systems can work. So I think for us, the aha moment was just experimenting and seeing the example of the demand for this and the drive for this and the want for a convenient way to reduce our own personal burden of waste, or for a business, a convenient way for them to be able to reduce cost on expensive compostable packaging while also protecting the environment. So when we kind of saw a microcosm of that through our pilot in East Vancouver, at the time I was still working a full-time job, and I was like, oh, you know what, this is the right time for this business, and it's worth the risk to dive into.
Single-use plastics, we hear the negative effects all the time. Foresight supports companies that are trying to fix the problem. You're getting ahead and trying to, I'm assuming, reduce and mitigate the problem so that people make better decisions. What are your main concerns regarding single-use plastics, given your passion for the space?
When we think about the problem, plastics is I think the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of other problems with single-use packaging at large. So we can get into that a little bit, but when it comes to plastic, I think like the major problem that I'm concerned about is around microplastics, primarily in the ocean, but now, even getting into our food and our health. And I think that is a really challenging problem to deal with, and especially the way that a lot of these single-use food service packaging and food service takeout items break down. It's quite concerning just from a health perspective and from an environmental conservation perspective. So that's probably the first element of it. But I think what I'm also more concerned about is just like, what are the alternatives? And I think a lot of the time and effort and energy and money gets spent on, well, if we could just find a magic material that can be thrown on the ground and it degrades in X days or put it in the water and it's done. And like the magic material, I haven't found it yet. When you find it, Jeanette, let me know. And but we realize that we're probably not going to get there, and it's likely that there's going to have to be some system and some system level change, like some holistic design change to the way that we go about consuming and the way our supply chain works, in order to solve and reorient the take, make, waste into more of a circular economy model. So when we see legislation come forward that bans single-use, problematic single-use plastics at a federal level, which is happening in Canada, that's great. It's a great step forwards. However, you need to ask the question of like, okay, well, what are we moving towards? And the answer is, as it stands right now, since we're still building the reuse infrastructure and the circular packaging infrastructure, the next alternative is going to be compostable packaging, right? Or alternative material packaging, which at this stage is still single use, and at this stage is still going to landfill primarily. So that has its own set of challenges. And I think that's really where we try to figure out, how do we partner publicly, privately, and attempt to create, circular infrastructure in conjunction with policy that's being put forward at various levels of government.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I do travel to Europe. I have a lot of friends and connections there. And in Germany, for example, there's so much reusable infrastructure, whether it's the bottles, even milk, juices, obviously a lot of liquid beverages, beer, wine, like there's such an incredible system in place. And yet here we really have this one and done sort of mentality. And I think, to exasperate that, just consumer habits in general are pretty out of whack. And I wonder sometimes if it's going to take, where we just don't have the space for the waste anymore. We just, where our infrastructure, not only for the packaging, but also for the product itself, food, when there's so much food waste, that we're actually going to be on quotas on how much garbage and waste and food we can consume and use, because the systems won't be able to handle it, and we're not going to have any choice. And I wonder why I'm constantly raving to my friends, like, let's go, you gotta have this mentality, right?
Yeah, and I would agree. I'm half German myself. My family's in Germany, and there's a town in Germany called Tübingen. I don't know if you've been there, Jeanette, but it's a beautiful little town, and they almost have a fully circular economy right now. And it kind of brings me back to a topic that we like to talk a lot about, which is like the concept of consumer consciousness, and how, I don't think, and this maybe stems beyond just plastic waste, it's perhaps related to other sectors as well. Like I'm not sure that we really have the luxury or the time to rely on, shifting consumer behavior and relying on consumer consciousness alone. Like I think it's a privilege to be environmentally aware. I think that a lot of people just are busy and working hard
trying
for their
to make
loved
ends
ones,
meet.
trying to make ends meet. And
yeah,
that's fine. Like, call what you want, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, etc. But I don't think that we need to pressure consumers to do something differently. I think the private sector, the public sector needs to put in place the infrastructure and design systems that allow people to go about their life in a better way than they are today, while also being more sustainable. So I think this concept of like reuse as default is something we think a lot about. We're able to do that on university campuses. Like we do work with Compass Group, and a little bit more work with Sodexo, and we work with campuses like universities, corporate campuses. In those environments, it's easier because you can have a top-down approach where it's like, this is the only dish that you're going to get. You can take it away for a few days, return it, or you will get charged $5 for it, and you can place it into any of these return bins. Mm-hmm. Whereas in an open network, it becomes a bit more tricky because we still rely, as it stands, on the choice of the consumer, because there's no one forcing them to use any alternative at this point. So yeah, it is a tough one, because a lot of the effort goes towards education, and we need to change behavior, which I think is certainly helpful, but to solve the problem at scale, I think we need to go a step further.
Basically, if I'm just paraphrasing, more regulation and investment in solutions that can really move the needle. Is that a fair
I think so. Yeah. I think it's an infrastructure problem. I think legislation, like from our conversations with folks making the policies, like they know what they want. They want to move towards a circular economy. It's been proven to be the most sustainable packaging solution. It's just that you need the infrastructure in place such that retailers can adopt it and consumers can adopt it. And that requires, it's a bit of a chicken or the egg problem. So it may be a step ladder or a seesaw type approach where it takes a little bit longer, or you do what the EU is doing, where they're just saying, nope, no, we're putting in reuse targets across the EU. By 2040, 80% of packaging, food service packaging, needs to be reusable. And restaurants, grocery stores, retailers need to report on that annually. Right. So that creates a clear signal for any investor looking at, okay, well, what are the companies that are providing the services to support this now? Great. Now we understand your business case. Here's money, go do it.
You've recently formed a partnership with Uber for pilot programs in some of Canada's major cities. Can you tell us a little bit about that initiative?
Yeah, we're really excited to sort of deepen our relationship with Uber. We actually started working with Uber early on, just at more kind of collaboratively. At this stage, we have an integration with their online ordering platform. It allows us to make the user experience more seamless. So it's kind of the idea where you can click a button, get this in reusable packaging, similar to where you check off my, I don't need cutlery. It'd be the yes, I want reusables, and it would get delivered to your door. We're running a set of tests with them to understand where is the adoption cycle at, like what incentives need to be in place for consumers and for stores to be able to adopt this. And then from there, we're going to be looking at kind of downstream problems like collection. Is there an opportunity to have an at-home pickup, for example? Like, most people who are ordering Uber Eats are convenience orientated. Is there a subsegment of that consumer base that would be interested in getting this in reuse? And then how can we make it easier and better for them? So we're starting here in Vancouver, and we will be working closely with a handful of stores, and then trying to scale up across Vancouver, and then looking at a number of markets in Eastern Canada as well. So yeah, looking forward to working closer with them as well.
Do you find the market in Canada more open-minded towards these solutions? Do you have a goal to expand across the US, for example?
Well, the only U.S. market we're in right now is in Washington State, so we're in Seattle, and I think the border isn't necessarily the barrier towards what we found, like willingness to adopt. I think there's a number of other variables that we look at when we think about a city, and the likelihood of the population to choose reusables. So we think the Cascadia region has really nice characteristics for a citywide reuse networks. So kind of up and down this Cascadia corridor. And then also on the East Coast as well. There's a couple of states like Colorado we've looked at where there's some campuses and good networks of groups that we think would be looking to adopt reuse. And we also have lots of cities, campuses reach out to us from all over North America saying, hey, when are you going to be in our area? We have a business, we have a store, we have a community group that wants to participate in this. So I think for us, like our vision is to enable reuse across North America, both in cities, campuses, and places where people eat and drink, and how can we allow that to be a universal, standardized network. So I think that the key is trying to understand how we can work with existing infrastructure in place to be able to scale quicker. So rather than trying to reinvent every wheel and build out our own logistics network, our own cleaning infrastructure, can we focus on what we're good at, which is the software, the user experience, and the IoT, and then connect the infrastructure and just reorient the existing systems that are already in place?
Yeah, that makes sense. I love that. We really try to help companies figure out where their strengths are and lean in on those strengths, as opposed to trying to. It's good to disrupt value chains. Big fan, but yeah, start with that wedge and win in that area, and then who knows what you can explore from there. Other than food delivery, where do you think reusables can have a large impact?
So outside of food delivery, we've experimented in a number of different customer verticals. We've had a lot of success helping film and television production sets reduce their waste. Vancouver has about a $4 billion film and TV industry. We've worked with the likes of Disney and Netflix to help them reduce packaging waste on the sets here. Other verticals that we've supported and done pilots with are music festivals, live events, stadiums, sports arenas, concerts. There's lots of opportunities in those verticals that we're interested in. I think as it stands right now, we're focused on food packaging, food and beverage, food service. There's certainly a big chunk of work to be done outside of food. So if you think about like e-commerce, non-food, even B2B distribution packaging, there's a ton of untapped potential in those markets as well. But Amazon started with books, so I think we'll take what we can get right now within food packaging.
And last but not least, looking forward 3-5 years, if you have a 10-year big hairy audacious goal, would love to hear it. But where do you see reusables and the impact that it's had on Canada and the world's circular economy?
So our BHAG is reuse is default in North America. So what does that mean? That means that majority of food service packaging is reusable in North America. That's a 10-year plan for us. Working backwards from that, in 5 years from now, we really want to be capturing the most impact that we can control. So we know that we're not in control of what legislation does. We know that we don't have the lung capacity to change consumer behavior at scale. So what we're trying to do right now is develop the best user experience, the best technology, and ensure that reuse can be as convenient as single use for users, and then try and get the most reuses, the most containers or single-use packaging waste diverted with customers that we can support directly. So that's the best example of that is going to be university campuses, corporate campuses, and closed loop environments like hospitals, et cetera, where we can impact the cafeteria, the food service, the dining area, the retail environment within that closed network. So those are relationships that we are developing right now. And then, in conjunction with that, we hope to continue deepening our ties with folks like Uber Eats that, once legislation does come in, we're there to support from an infrastructure perspective.
For a long time, single-use plastics have been the only option for consumers. It's not until recently that we've had viable options become available. Unfortunately, many of those options are still early in their development. However, addressing how we consume is the first step in making system-wide changes that can lead to a more sustainable economy. Nothing will move the needle towards net zero faster than policy, and ultimately the burden lies with government and industry, but consumer habits will play an important role in the transition to a green economy. By choosing sustainable options like those products made from recycled materials or with eco-friendly certifications, consumers send a powerful signal to businesses that there is a market for sustainable goods. Companies won't always do the right thing and make the necessary changes until they see the profit motive. Often corporations only implement sustainable practices once consumers demand them. So for the second part of today's show, I'd like to share my discussion with Lee Malleau about consumer habits and how they can change the market. Lee has run Globalnomics from Alberta since 2013 and works closely with public and private partners across multiple sectors from energy to screen media, agriculture, and science and technologies. From a career as an award-winning journalist, she transitioned into economic and business development with a focus on international investment and trade, including developing global best practices on business and investment programs during major events like the Olympics and the World Fair when she was CEO of Vancouver's Economic Development Corporation. Here's more from Lee on her background and our discussion around the future of consumer behaviors.
So a lot of my background is on economics, economic systems, and economic development, which means that I look at how do we connect that macro environment to the micro environment with sustainable changes, opportunities, development, investment that can actually make change at the local level. For example, on the economic development perspective, it's a matter of looking at what are the legitimate opportunities associated with scaling and growth at the entire community level, and then how does the community take steps in order order to support those with all of its private sector partners, whether they're in the community or outside the community. And a big portion of that is looking at consumer behaviors and citizen behaviors associated with, you know, what's the chicken, what's the egg, what drives what. And so I'm loving the opportunity to have this conversation around what and how consumers drive this conversation and this major change.
A little fun fact about myself, I was sort of one of those annoying friends since I was a teen, that I would be harassing different friends at their houses and their parents, wondering why they're not recycling. And it actually went as far as when I met.
Perfect.
I was on a date with my, I ended up the father of my daughter, but one of our first dates, he invited me back to dinner to his place, and he was making dinner, and I sort of threw something in the garbage, and I realized that there was a can in the garbage, and that pretty much, I took a step back, and I'm like, if you are going to not have strong recycling habits, then we cannot stay together. So I've sort of been a bit of a tyrant around that. And I mean, it ebbs and flows, right? I think one of the things I'm excited about is our conversation today is, you know, the last year and a half in particular, I've been making a very conscious effort to take things to the next level. It's easy to get into habits around fast fashion and, you know, buying the next new cell phone and you know, like, if we're going to be doing this, I think we need to go all in. And so I'm really excited to see what we can come up with for the audience on this podcast, so that they can, you know, find their own journey to better practices.
Yeah, perfect. And, you know, a big part of that is based on, you know, if you, like you said, with your dating experience, is that a shared value that you have? And if it's incompatible, then that's, you know, that's an issue. And I love the idea that today we're going to talk about, if it isn't a shared value now, how can we change our own behavior habits, consumer habits, so that we can maybe lead by example, or look at what are the compromise solutions between, you know, no recycling and at least working towards full recycling. There's always room for improvement, as we know. And I think so much of it starts with the consumer and consumer education.
That's a great segue into one of the reports that I pulled up in preparation for our chat. And, you know, Deloitte, it's in their third year of conducting a survey into consumer attitudes and behaviors around sustainability. And, you know, what they're finding is that consumers are increasingly making conscious decisions. However, there still needs to be a lot done in order to give consumers greater access to information and offer better affordability and availability of options.
Agreed. I think so too. I love that study and their key findings, which talk about, you know, the adoption. And again, adoption and adaptation, it's such a big part of this, and understanding that as humans, we generally resist change to begin with, and changing our mindset. And that's the entire focus of this transition we have made worldwide, for most developed nations anyway, into the digital economy. And it's not about how well you use your smartphone, it's about how well we adapt and adopt changes, whether it's changes in technology, whether it's changes in our eating habits or recycling habits. That's a big part of it. So I see they have that at the top of their list. And the rest of it, I love that fashion with a conscience, and helping consumers, you know, really understand what it is that they're buying and what the back end of that purchase looks like.
I think we need to start with something that is critical to our survival, and that everyone seems to be talking about across Canada and globally, which is food security, food waste. Something that you have quite a lot of perspective on when it comes to fish farming and so many other avenues of the value chain. Where are we really at when it comes to food security?
As a foodie, and I admit I'm an obsessive foodie, but I'm very much about quality over quantity, and, you know, do a lot of work around What does it mean from a global perspective? We know from a tremendous amount of research, global research with, the World Agricultural UNFO, that we are starting to hit food crisis from a global perspective. Exacerbating that has been COVID, as well as the war in the Ukraine with Russia. And that has had a huge impact on accelerating what we already knew was a trend in terms of the scarcity of food. And it's not that we can't produce enough food in the world, it's the types of food, the basic staples, and protein. Protein's a really big one. And this is what started us off on this conversation, was around, fish, the blue economy, fish and seafood production. But I think it's important to understand some of the background information associated with that. So if we look at global population reaching 10 billion, sometime even before 2050, depending on whose prediction you look at, we need to increase food production by up to 70% just to meet a world population of that size on shrinking land, with climate change impacts that is having, as we know, dramatic effects on our food production. Especially in countries with variable weather patterns. And Canada is one of them, in Western Canada in particular. So what does that mean? That means that, foods like protein, animal protein, for example, are going to become scarce first. And that certainly has been the impetus of a big focus on the world. There's a race to develop alternative proteins, pea proteins and seed proteins, and all kinds of different other forms of protein, soy protein, and alternative meats in order to change that consumer behavior. So that's the trigger. Get it into, fast food chains like A&W, where people are already looking for alternatives, and it puts it in front of them. And it's been modestly successful, but it's just the beginning. The other piece of that, of course, is the blue economy around fish and seafood, which is one of the largest worldwide demands for animal protein. But we have depleted our oceans by about 80 to 85%, 86%, depending on who you talk to, of fish and seafood, and they're not being replenished. The scarcity, even in the grocery stores today, of finding what we used to find at Costco. And I've talked to their supply managers at Costco in Western Canada, who are saying they're having great difficulty sourcing regular salmon, farm salmon, for example. And I know there's a lot of controversy over that, but if we continue to consume salmon at the same rate, and we're not farming it, and BC is, obviously looking very intently at how they're eliminating fish farming licenses on the West Coast, which is an entire different conversation, then how are we going to meet those demands? Because the increase of illegal fishing has accelerated as we see the depletion of the ocean. So we need to look globally at how do we resolve that, and we start with the consumer.
One of the things you talked about is quality over quantity. And again, many of us generations have just seen access of food on the shelves, and perhaps even through COVID. And as a result of, supply chain issues still, impacted through COVID, we're seeing that there's just scarcity in certain foods and resources at the grocery store. I'm also a big believer that in general, we overeat as a population. There's portion control challenges. And I think we might see that if food scarcity continues to become an issue, we might actually have some restraints or considerations on what we can actually purchase as individual consumers. And I do believe as well that if we sort of have more of a moderated consumption pathway as individuals and communities, not only will we sort of have a positive influence on our supply chain as it relates to food, but we might be healthier as a population, right? Sometimes a little less is more. And what I also find is, unfortunately, fresh food and healthy food is so much more expensive than a lot of the processed stuff, which I think should blow all of our minds at this point.
Yeah.
Let's dig into the, fish and seafood aspect. I mean, what you said, quite frankly, scares the crap out of me. Like 86%, we've basically pillaged through our food resources in water. And I mean, can we recover from that? Is there a pathway to recovery? How do we inform the general populace that this is a big problem we should all be putting our effort into resolving?
I think, we should be very afraid of that and very concerned about it. And I'm not sure it's as widely known as we need it to be, because, of our consumption habits have not always been informed. But, the challenges on recovery, I think for some, depending on, which marine biologist I talk to, for some species, fish and seafood, there's probably some recovery, but exacerbating their demise is climate change. We're starting to see increasing numbers of tropical ocean species that are coming into colder waters, like Canadian waters. Canada has some of the most significant coastline in the world, and we don't always have invest enough in ocean monitoring equipment and policies to be able to manage all that. As we're seeing some of these species come into Canadian waters, we're also seeing some of the illegal fishing and increasing amounts of illegal fishing coming into Canadian waters. So I think climate change is going to have a huge impact because of the warming of waters, the impact on salmon. I think salmon is probably the most fragile and vulnerable species in terms of large popular consumptive fish species. And the fact that a lot of the salmon farms on the West Coast have been eliminated, and this year there's a big spike in salmon coming back to spawn, has generated a lot of conversation. I think we don't know yet if it's causation or correlation, and sometime will tell us, but we might be able to protect the wild species we have. But one way of doing that is also to look at what does a viable, sustainable, healthy fish farming look like? And probably the solution to that these days is to look inland at large scale commercial fish farming systems that can meet consumer demand. But I love your point about, well, should we even be eating this at this stage? Is it realistic to look at consumers and say, you only get one salmon a week, especially for, pescatarians who have a lot of fish and seafood as a substantive portion of their diet?
Moving on from seafood, because we're going to come back to it, even sort of want to dig into broader proteins. Obviously the beef industry in Canada is strong, and we're also seeing an uptick in alternative proteins. I think the protein supercluster has done a tremendous job in formalizing Canada's strategic efforts around alternative proteins. But what a lot of people don't know, and I think this is more of a well-known fact than the issues with our fish supply, is that traditional proteins, cattle, huge methane impacts, which are an accelerator to climate change. The consumption of water to feed all the different animals that we eat, the grains, water, chemicals, hopefully not chemicals, but natural supplements to grow grains and food supply for all the animals that we eat. It's this incredible cycle of consumption. What are your thoughts on, protein, traditional protein supply outside of fish and seafood? Are you seeing some of the major challenges there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think depending on who you talk to, animal production for consumption is controversial for many, many reasons. And one of them, like you say, with cattle is because of methane gas. Interestingly, there's been a ton of work and investment, especially here in Alberta, because, it is a very large global producer of beef cattle, in looking at the types of feed that can be used for cattle that help to produce less methane. And now there's a company in Alberta that has developed developed a feed pellet that has all the nutrients that the cattle need, that produces about 80 to 84% less methane gas. So that is solving that problem. In terms of taking a look at levels of consumption that are taking place now, and how do we improve sustainability based on that level of consumption. But like you say, it's about what does the future look like? Never mind, 10 years from now, but even 5 years from now, around affordability, as we've seen prices for animal protein skyrocket. What are the alternatives and how can we make those affordable so people can have balanced diets?
Do you think people really understand the fact that climate change, even just a few degrees, has a devastating impact on even non-protein production, like grains, salads, tomatoes, fruits? I've spent quite a bit of time on a few farms out here across BC and sort of understanding their net zero pathways and what they're working on. And one of the biggest things we hear is that it's the lack of predictability. The weather and the changing environment to grow products is making it very hard for them to see a path forward to, economic, at least some economic gains for the work. People have to survive. And then we get into this conversation around, wow, greenhouse technology and all these other pieces of infrastructure that these farmers and our entire, food supply chain are going to have to look at investing in, and where is that money going to come from? And so we've created this problem of climate change, and now we're going to have to implement all of these solutions, and some of them incredible. Obviously, that's what we do here at Foresight. We're all about clean tech solutions, but the conversation today is about consumer habits and this cycle of unfortunate resolve. So, what are your thoughts on even just the impacts of climate change on those basic things that we consume, fruit, vegetables, etc., every day? And then, how can we rectify that? What can we do? Should that be top of mind for consumers as they're making their buying decisions?
Absolutely. And we're getting better at that, in terms of understanding where that food comes from. And I think next generations, certainly that the Deloitte study on consumerism talks about how next generations are, much more apt to look at the sustainable development of the food that they're eating. But more importantly, climate change. So last year and earlier this year, I did a program. I participated in a program at the University of Alberta called the Economics of Climate Change and Global Food Production. And that's exactly what the topic was, is what's happening in terms of the impacts of climate change on food production. And it's quite radical. We're looking at, and we're experiencing this more and more, whole national crops being wiped out by drought, by torrential rain, by baseball size hail, hitting central Alberta, for example, which wiped out crops for an entire, local grown farm and all of their production. And they don't have crop insurance the way that regular farm and agricultural producers do. So that changes the economics of it as well, and undermines the ability of smaller farming operations to actually produce food that goes directly to the consumer. So those are all things that are systemically important for us to address. The other part of that on the solution side is that we're increasingly seeing innovators come in, and here's the technology piece, with farming systems and food production systems like vertical farming, which I think is a phrase that most people understand fairly well. But technology-based food production systems that are game changing because it can be done in a much more controlled environment. And I honestly think that's the future, where we're going to look at localized and regionalized food supply chains, because we can't rely on them. And when I go to the Asian supermarket, and I love it, I go in there for 2 or 3 hours and I just walk around looking at all the foods. But I also marvel at the fact that we can get foods, from these countries that are so far away that we would never have had access to even 20 years ago because of our supply chain systems. But now those are being tremendously impacted. So climate change, supply chains, value chains, and looking at technology that can protect and advance and accelerate food production on a regional basis is going to be a big part of the solution.
We all need to start making smarter decisions as consumers. The IPCC's latest report on climate change indicated that we are very close to reaching a point of no return, where the damage to Earth's critical ecosystems will be irreversible. We need to act with haste if we want to avoid the worst effects of climate change. That means reducing our consumption of luxury goods, single-use items, and products that are made via non-renewable, heavily polluting raw materials. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Cleantech Forward. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Cleantech Forward podcast wherever you listen, and to share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Next month, we'll be back to our regular programming with an episode focused on some of the organizations that we are working with to accelerate the deployment of clean tech solutions and supporting Canadian clean tech innovators as they move us towards net zero. I'll see you there.
To learn more about Foresight's programs, events, and more, visit us at foresightcac.com or follow us on social at Foresight CAC.